Hi, this is Kim Scott, and I am excited to tell you a little bit about my new book, Radical Respect. I decided that I had to write this book shortly after Radical Candor came out because of some feedback that I got about Radical Candor. If you write a book about feedback, you're bound to get a lot of it, and indeed I did. And hands down, the best feedback I got came from the CEO of a company where I was doing a talk. And I was really excited to work with her because she had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade and a person I like and respect enormously. And she's one of too few Black women CEOs in tech or frankly, any other sector. And when I finished giving the Radical Candor talk to her team, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone, even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true as soon as she said it to me. And I knew how unfair it was because she's one of the most reasonable people I've ever worked with. And as soon as she said this to me, I had four realizations at the same time. The first realization was that I had not been the kind of colleague I imagined myself to be. I had failed to be an upstander. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we had ever been in together, even though I knew she had what to be ticked off about from time to time, as we all do at work. But she was not allowed to express how she really felt, and that must have taken a terrible toll on her. And I failed to intervene in any way, shape, or form. Instead, I was sort of a silent bystander, or an oblivious even bystander. And that's not who I imagined myself to be. Now, the second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her as a Black woman in the workplace, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a white woman in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit that but I had been pretending that a whole host of things were not happening that were in fact happening. And so, and I think the reason why I did that was that I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. And so therefore, when I was experiencing disrespectful attitudes or behaviors, I didn't choose a response. Instead, I just pretended it wasn't happening. Now, the third thing that I realized, and by the way, these are roles that we all play from time to time. So the third thing that I realized was that as much as I didn't want to think of myself as a victim, even less did I want to think of myself as a culprit. So I was most deeply in denial about the times when I was the person who caused harm. And because I was pretending that I'd done nothing wrong, I couldn't possibly acknowledge what I had done wrong or make amends for it. And then the fourth thing that I realized was that as a leader, by pretending that these kinds of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not happening on my team, when in fact they were, I was failing to prevent them from getting in the way of our ability to do the best work of our lives and to enjoy working together, to work together better. And so before we sort of analyze what is it that was going wrong, let's think about what goes right. What is radical respect? Radical respect is what happens when we optimize for collaboration and we honor one another's individuality at the same time. And very few of us intentionally create a coercive work environment. And I don't think anybody says, oh, I want to be coerced at work. So what is it that moves us wrong on that dimension of radical respect? Also, in terms of honoring individuality, I've never met anyone who says, oh yeah, what I really want to do is to work in a 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of work environment. I think we intend to honor other people's individuality, and we expect our own individuality to be honored. So what is it that makes us start demanding conformity? I think three things get in the way of radical respect. Well, a million things, but let's focus on the big three: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think one of the reasons that we fail to intervene is that we conflate these three things as though they're the same thing. And so, one of the things that can help us solve a problem is to break it down into its component parts and then to define those parts. So, bias, I'm going to offer you some super simple definitions. Bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it, it's usually unconscious. Prejudice, on the other hand, I'm going to define as meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And last but not least, bullying. Usually there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, going on at all here. It's just being mean. Now that we've sort of know what we're looking for, what do we say when we notice it? Often we don't know what to say. So what can you say when you don't know what to say? In the case of bias, I recommend an I statement. An I statement kind of holds up a mirror and lets the other person know what they've said or done. They hadn't meant it. One of my favorite stories about bias comes from a friend of mine who told me about someone who was an upstander on her team. She went into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. And she sat at the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. And her two colleagues who were men sat to her left. And when the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to her left, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. That's actually often how bias shows up: who decides to sit next to or across from whom. When she started talking and the other side had questions, they did not direct their questions at her, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men. That's also often how bias shows up. Anybody ever notice that happening? So it happened once, it happened twice, and then the third time it happened, her colleague, an excellent upstander, stood up and he said, "I think we should just switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room, because as soon as he used that I statement, the other side realized what they were doing and they knocked it off. They started responding to the person who was speaking. Now, he did that for three important reasons. The first was kind of emotional. He liked her and he didn't like seeing her get ignored. The second was very practical. He just wanted to win the deal and he knew that they wouldn't win if the other side wouldn't listen to her. And then the third thing was kind of an efficiency game, because he realized it was easier for him as an upstander to hold up the mirror than it would have been for her to do it. So that's a simple example of an I statement. Great way to hold up a mirror. However, if it's prejudice, holding up a mirror is not going to work, because the other person's going to smile in that mirror. They're going to like what they see. Yeah, they believe that thing. So in the case of prejudice, you want an it statement. An it statement draws a boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they cannot impose their beliefs on others. And it is an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. Here's an example. At one point in my career, shortly after I had had twins, I returned to work after parental leave, and I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said to me, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And this to me was like a gut punch. And I sort of wanted to make a joke of it, because I didn't really think he meant it the way I thought that this was a bias, not meaning it. And so I said to him, in order to clear the air, "Oh, I decided to come to work today because I wanted to neglect my children." And I was expecting him to laugh and apologize and move on. However, that is not what happened. He said, "Oh no, Kim, it's really not good that you're working, and it's bad for your children." And so I was able to use, there were a bunch of HR policies at this company that should have indicated to him that he shouldn't be saying that. So I said, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me that I am neglecting my children by not showing up at work today." And that had the desired impact. He took a big step back. And I said to him, "Look, now I'm going to appeal to common sense." I said, "Look, I'm not going to make a thing of this with HR, because you and I need to work well together. But I think we can agree that it is my decision, together with my spouse, how we raise our kids, just as it is your decision, together with your partner, how you raise your kids. And furthermore, I'm guessing you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research. And then he kind of laughed and he got it. And we worked well together after that. So that's a simple example of an it statement. Just show someone where that boundary is. Now, if it's bullying that you're confronting, showing someone where the boundary is a guarantee that they're going to try to kick past that boundary. The bullying, by definition, is pushing past boundaries. And also bias, an I statement sort of invites someone in closer to you. And with bullying, you want to push them away a little bit. So in the case of bullying, I recommend a you statement. I learned this from my daughter. When she was in third grade, she was getting bullied. And I said to her, "Oh, tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah." So I was recommending an I statement. And my daughter looked at me and she banged her fist on the table and she said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why should I why should I tell them they succeeded?" I'm like, "Huh, that is a very good point." So you don't want to use an I statement in the face of bullying. You want a you statement. "You can't talk to me like that." Or a you question, "What is going on for you here?" Or even just a you non sequitur. "Where'd you get that shirt?" The point is, a you statement pushes someone away a little bit and it's putting you in an active stance. You're not submitting to whatever they're saying. You are taking a little bit more charge of the conversation. You're not in a submissive role. Now, this is easier said than done. And I want to take a beat to say that hopefully most of the time it will be an upstander who intervenes in some way. But I wrote Radical Respect in part to say thank you to the many upstanders who helped me succeed in my career. And the last thing I want to do for you as an upstander is put you in harm's way. So I want to acknowledge that sometimes speaking directly is going to feel like the right thing to do, but sometimes it may not feel like the right thing to do. So there are 5 different ways to be a great upstander. You can say something directly in the moment. You can also delay just a little bit what your intervention. And by delay, what I mean is wait till after the event happens and then check in with the person who was harmed. Here's an example of why this is so important. At one point in my career, I was being introduced with 2 colleagues who were men on a stage in front of 5,000 people. And the guy who was introducing us introduced one guy, shook his hand, introduced the next guy, shook his hand, and introduced me. And I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And instead of shaking my hand, he grabbed it and he kissed it. He kind of licked my hand. It was disgusting. And it was one of those cringe moments. But what was even worse than that was that not one of those 5,000 people came up to me afterwards and checked in and said, "That was weird. Are you okay?" Like, and that made me feel gaslit. So just checking in with someone can be a really powerful way to be a great upstander. Another thing you can do is you can create a distraction. Spill your cup of coffee, whatever it is. And sometimes that will give the person who is harmed the capacity to sort of regain their composure. Another thing you can do is delegate. Catch someone else's eye, and someone else who might be in a better position than you are to intervene. And you can delegate up, you can delegate sideways, you can delegate to someone whose job it is to address the problem. And last but not least, you can document. We're all traveling around with these supercomputers in our pocket. But remember, if you take a video, if you write it down, you do not own what was recorded or what you wrote. It's the person harmed who owns it. So those are a few thoughts on what you can do to be a great upstander. Now, let's also talk about what leaders can do to make responding expected, because we all have a role to play here, and leaders in particular have an important role. In the case of bias, leaders can create bias disruptors. What I mean by this is you want to help your team understand how to point out bias in the moment when it's happening. Because if you just ignore it, then you're reinforcing and reflecting it. So you want to make sure that you're able to call it out in the moment. In the case of prejudice, you want to create space for conversation, because it's pretty easy for me to say, using its statement, there's a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on others. It's kind of hard to know where that line is. So create a space for conversation and talk to your team. In the case of bullying, you want to create consequences. You want to create conversational consequences. You need to learn how to shut it down in the moment. You also, when you notice it, you also want to create compensation consequences. You don't want to give high ratings or bonuses to people who bully others, because if you reward that kind of behavior, you're going to get more of it. It's going to escalate. It's going to get worse. And last but not least, you want to create career consequences. The last thing you want to do is promote people who bully others. There comes a moment on too many teams' histories when the jerks begin to win. And that is the moment when the culture of that team begins to lose. But it's not enough not to promote people who bully others. You also need to give them feedback. And if they can't change their behavior, you need to fire them. It is better to have a hole than an asshole. But again, it's really hard to do. So those are a few high level things that leaders must do. What I want to do now is to double click on how you can teach your team to disrupt bias in 3 simple steps. First, I recommend sitting down with your team and coming up with a shared vocabulary. What are you all going to say or do to disrupt bias when you notice it? I recommend a purple flag. I love the purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not an orange flag. It's not a red flag. It sort of invites people in, and it's easier than an I statement. However, other teams I've worked with have said things like, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. One team I worked with would throw up a peace sign. Another team would say yo. So the point is, don't sort of impose vocabulary on your team. Instead, talk to them and figure out from them what is the word or phrase that they are actually going to use. Now, there's a second thing you need to do. You need to make sure that you are creating a shared norm for what to say or do when it's you who said or done the bias thing, when it's you whose bias is being disrupted. Because I don't know about you, but for me, when someone points out to me that I've said or done something that is biased, I feel ashamed. And when I feel ashamed, I can tell you where in my body I feel it. My legs, the backs of my legs begin to tingle. And it's the same physical sensation that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. And this is bad because now I'm in shame brain. But there's no magic words that other people can use to prevent that. I'm going to feel ashamed. And so it's my job to move through it. But as a leader, you can teach people how to move through it by starting out by saying, thank you for pointing it out. And then one of two things: either I get it, I'll work on not doing it again, or I don't get it. Can you let me know after the meeting what I did wrong? Now, the second thing is really hard to say, at least for me, because when I don't get it, I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've harmed someone, and I'm also ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. And yet this happens to me, and I promise it's going to happen to you. It happens to all of us, probably on a daily basis. So just normalizing that admission, like I just screwed up and I don't even know what I did wrong, will really help people learn to disrupt bias, and then you'll minimize the bias. You'll never probably eliminate it, but you can begin to minimize bias that shows up. The third thing you need to do is to have a shared commitment to doing this, to actually doing this, because it's easy for me to say disrupt bias, really hard to do it. It's going to be uncomfortable. You got to embrace the discomfort and build the stamina to move through this. So those are just a few thoughts on things you can do to work together better. Of course, there's much more to the story, and I hope that you will enjoy reading Radical Respect and that it will help you work together better. Thank you so much.